What if I told you that Coco isn't really a movie about music or even chasing your dreams? What if the emotional center of Coco is actually something much quieter and much more human? A story about aging, about memory, and about the quiet fear that one day the people we love might forget us. Because once we start looking at Coco through that lens, something interesting happens. The most important character in the entire film stops being Miguel. It becomes the movie's namesake, Coco herself. When we first meet Coco, she is extremely old and physically fragile. She sits quietly in the family home while the rest of the household moves around her, speaking rarely and responding only occasionally. Sometimes it's unclear whether she's following the conversation happening around her at all. The family speaks to her gently, but they do not expect much of a response. To younger viewers, she may simply appear to be a very elderly relative, the kind of figure almost every family recognizes from their own gatherings. But anyone who has spent time around aging grandparents or older relatives or adults recognizes something deeper in those specific scenes. Coco is living in a world where many of the memories that once defined her life are beginning to fade. The film never labels what is happening to her. There's no diagnosis, no dramatic explanation, and no moment where the family sits down to discuss what is specifically happening to her. Instead, her fading memory is treated as a quiet reality that everyone around her has learned to live with. And in many ways, that is exactly how aging and memory loss appear in real life. It rarely arrives with a clear announcement. More often, it unfolds slowly. Names become harder to recall, stories repeat, conversations drift, families adapt to these changes gradually, often without realizing how much has shifted until much later. Coco captures that quiet transformation with surprising honesty, but the film is doing something even more interesting than simply portraying aging. It is exploring how families respond when someone's memories begin to fade. In many stories about aging, older characters are pushed to the edges of the narrative. They become symbolic figures or background presences whose inner lives are no longer explored. But Coco's family treats hers differently. She remains part of the household. She's still present in those family moments. People speak to her, sit beside her, and care for her with a quiet patience. Those details may seem small, but culturally, they matter. Stories shape how societies think about aging. When films portray older adults as invisible or disconnected, audiences begin to absorb that idea. That idea starts to permeate into our culture. But when stories show families continuing to honor someone's presence, even when their memory is fading, it reinforces a different kind of cultural value. It reminds us that memory loss does not erase a person's humanity. The emotional center of Coco finally reveals itself near the end of the film in one of the most powerful scenes ever created. Miguel sits beside Coco and begins to sing, "Remember Me." Earlier in the film, the song is introduced as a performance piece. It is grandiose, theatrical, something Ernesto de la Cruz sings on stage to entertain an audience. Within that context, the song is about fame and legacy. But when Miguel sings it to Coco, the meaning of the song changes completely. Suddenly, it's no longer about performance. It becomes something deeply personal. Miguel sings softly, almost like a lullaby, and slowly something shifts in Coco's expression. The melody reaches a place in her memory that had been buried beneath time and age. She begins to recognize the song her father once sang to her when she was a child. And through that music, a memory returns. Her father, her childhood, a relationship that had been somewhere inside of her mind. It is an extraordinary moment, not because it feels magical, but because it feels deeply human. Music has a remarkable ability to reconnect us with memory, even when other forms of recall become difficult. Songs from earlier periods in our life can still trigger emotional responses and fragments of personal history. Caregivers often see this phenomenon with aging relatives. Someone who struggles to recognize people may still remember songs from their youth, singing along with surprising clarity. Coco captures that reality in a way that feels both gentle and authentic. But the film is also exploring a deeper theme that runs beneath the entire story: the fear of being forgotten. Within the mythology of Coco, people in the land of the dead continue to exist only as long as someone in the living world remembers them. When the last person who remembers them disappears, they experience what the film calls the final death. First, this idea seems like a creative piece of world building, a poetic way of tying the story to the traditions of Dia de los Muertos. But emotionally, the idea resonates with something very real. Because memory is one of the ways human beings keep each other alive across generations. Stories, photographs, traditions, and songs all serve as a way of carrying someone's identity forward, even when they are gone. When Coco begins to lose access to her memories, The responsibility for remembering her father's story almost disappears with her. The truth about her family's past nearly fades away entirely. And that is why the scene with Remember Me matters so much. Miguel is not just singing a song, he's restoring important memory. What Coco ultimately reminds us is that memory does not exist only within individuals' minds, it also lives within families and communities. The traditions of Dia de los Muertos reflect this beautifully. Through altars, photographs, and shared stories, families actively remember those who came before them. Memory becomes collective, something shared. And when one person can no longer carry those memories alive, others can keep them alive. In that sense, Coco is not simply a film about music or adventure, it's a story about how families hold on to identity together across time. It is a story about what happens when memory begins to fade and about the ways love continues to preserve the stories that define who we are. By the time the film ends, Coco has done something remarkable. It has taken a deeply human experience, the gradual fading of memory that accompanies aging, and transformed it into a story about connection, remembrance, and family. Because when someone we love begins to forget, the responsibility for remembering does not disappear, it shifts. And perhaps this is the real meaning behind the song that carried the entire film. Remember me, not as a request for fame or recognition, but as a quiet hope that the people who come after us will carry our stories forward. Because in the end, memory is not something we just lose. It's something we give to one another. And that may be the most beautiful truth hidden inside of Coco.